Hello, fellow SREs. Welcome back to SRE with Ben. Today, we're going to learn about transaction snapshots and continue further on business transactions. This video is a continuation of business transactions part 1. I suggest you watch the part 1 of business transactions to understand this video better. When we click on drill down under a business transaction, it takes us to a session called as call graphs. So, what is a call graph? A call graph is a trace of a transaction flow in your application. The call graph gives details of how the request flows in your application, what are the calls made, what are the different types of function calls made, what are the different external calls made, such as DB calls, web service calls, etc. It provides the details as to from when the user initiated the transaction, how the transaction came into the code, how it flows from one call to another within the application code, and how each section of the code performs, and if there are any issues in the code. For example, you can see a call graph for this slow transactions, and I can see there are two different calls once it comes inside the application. One is a JDBC call, and I can see this is the amount of time it took to finish this transaction, that is 45 milliseconds. And there is another flow, that is the servlet flow, where it took most of my response time, and around 98% of my transaction flow had taken place in this flow. When I drill down deeper into this call, I can see where exactly my code is taking time to execute and what is causing my transaction to slow down. Since out of these two calls, the second call is the costliest call for me, I'm going to set this as root so that I can dig deeper into this transaction. I'm going to eliminate things that are not useful for me. So I've set the transaction flow 2 as my entry point, and I'm digging deeper. Now, when I dig deeper into the second transaction, I can see this HTTP service call is again taking more time. So let me set this as root and dig deeper into this call. This will help me divide and conquer and try to understand where exactly the issue is and perform root cause analysis. When I expand this HTTP servlet call, I can see that there are few method invocations that are actually costly for me, which is taking around 2% of the transaction time, and that is around 80 milliseconds. So all these are related to the jar loader get bytes call, and that is taking more time. This way, I can use the call graph to dig deeper into the transaction flow and performance and do root cause analysis and identify exactly where the problem lies. This call graph is very useful for application support team. They can do RCA using this call graph and identify where exactly application slowdown is happening and what action could be taken. If it's a code level issue, this can be passed on to the developer and code level tweaking could be done. This will give the developer a clear cut picture of how the code is performing, and he can do some performance testing. So that's about call graph. To reset the route to see the complete call graph again, just click on reset route and it will take you again to the complete flow. Again, if you want to drill deeper into any other flow, you can always right click on the flow and click on set route. If suppose in a transaction, you identify that a method call is taking too much time and you would like to know what are the values that are being passed to that method for the parameters that the method uses, then you can configure something called as a data collector. For example, if your search order method is taking too much time and you would like to understand for which orders this method is taking too much time, then you will have to track it at the parameter level to see which orders are being passed when it takes too much time. For that, we will have to configure the data collector. To configure a data collector for a particular method, you can identify the method in the call graph and right click on it and click on configure instrumentation for this class or method. And here you can confirm what type of instrumentation you would like to configure. For example, in my case, I want to configure a data collector, method invocation data collector. Click on OK. Here it will ask you a few details that you will have to fill in. First is the name for the data collector. So I'm going to name it test DC data collector. And what is the class? And this is the class name since I already identified it using the call graph. Then what is the method name? I'm going to type search order. If the method is overloaded method, then you will have to click through here um, and click on add parameters for which parameter that you would like to track the values. In my case, it will be order ID. And what are the conditions? For example, if you feel that there are few order IDs for which you suspect that this method is performing slow, you can add the order ID. So whenever your parameter value matches with this condition, then your data collector will collect the details. So here you can have different types of string matches as well. For example, starts with, ends with, etc. If you would like to collect the return values of this function, for example, if a function returns a collection or a string or a integer, you can add those variable names here or the return values here. The data collector will collect those values for you and you can use it as per your needs. So this way you can use an AppDynamics app agent even to capture the exact parameter value that is being passed to a method and how the method is performing, what are the return values that method is giving. This information is very useful for performing root cause analysis. You can use the data collector to identify which exact order the issue is causing and why the transaction is slowing down again. If you would like to export the call graph as a stat trace, then you can click on export and it will give you a complete stat trace and you can save this. So that's about a call graph in transaction snapshot. Now let's go ahead and explore what other information transaction snapshots provide for us. So in the overview section, you can see various details such as what is the user experience for this transaction, what is the overall execution time, 3.5 seconds, and what is the CPU time, at what time this transaction took place, which node, which tire, what is the business transaction name, and which URL. You can also see the thread name, thread ID, summary, and transaction thresholds that have marked this transaction as slow or normal or errors. Then we have the slow calls and error section where it lists down all the slow calls and what is the response time and what percentage of the transaction this call is taking. For example, my HTTP servlet call is taking around 68% of my overall transaction time. Here you can also view the error details if there are any exceptions in your transaction. Next, we have the DB and remote service calls where you get details regarding the DB calls and what is the query that was performed, what is the time it took to perform that query, how many number of calls we have to the DB, what time it took, and which tire, error, etc. Then we have a server tab where you can view the server performance during this transaction. This will help you identify if there is any server issue that would have caused your transaction to slow down and affect your application. This way, you can use transaction snapshots to perform your complete RCA without having to navigate into separate tabs. AppDynamics gives you a holistic view of the complete transaction, how the infrastructure is performing, how the transaction is flowing through your code, which part of the code there is an issue, and things like that. The overview section also gives you idea about potential issues that can cause your transaction to slow down or your application performance to get impacted. Here it has listed down method invocations that are high in response time. This can also give me an idea about what might be causing the slowness of my transaction. AppD uses AI internally to predict and understand when to capture transaction snapshots, but you can always configuring it. To configure the transaction snapshot interval, you'll have to click on configure and click on configure thresholds for slow install transactions. Here, when you scroll down, you can configure the periodic snapshot collection. By default, AppD collects snapshots every 10 minutes once or whenever there is an error or exception or slow transactions in between the 10-minute mark. You can change this value as per your need. The lesser the time interval, there is more load on your app agent and it can cause issues to your application performance as well. So you will have to make a wise decision as to configuring what is the time interval at which you would want the transaction snapshot to be captured. You can also configure various transaction thresholds such as slow, very slow, stalled. By default, AppD utilizes standard deviations and captures transaction thresholds. If you have a particular response time use case, you can manually set it here. For example, if I want any transaction which is more than 300 milliseconds to be captured as slow transactions, I can set the threshold here. If you want to configure thresholds at a single transaction level, or configure the snapshot collection at a single transaction level, even that can be done. For that, you will have to navigate inside the individual transaction thresholds and configure the required thresholds here. You're under transaction snapshots. You have various other details like all snapshots. Transaction diagnostic gives you a performance overview of the transaction, and slow and error transactions. If suppose you identify an abnormal transaction and you would like to capture transactions at a more frequent interval for a temporary session, then you can make use of diagnostic sessions. Using diagnostic sessions, you can configure an interval at which you would like to capture the snapshot for a period of time instead of changing the default behavior. For that, click on Start Session and select the business transactions that you would like to capture. For how long you want the transactions to be captured. For example, here for the next 10 minutes, I would like to capture 5 snapshots per minute, and I can click on Start Diagnostic Session. This will help me capture 5 transactions per minute for the next 10 minutes. This setting is for a temporary basis. So that's about transaction snapshots. For the next video, we will be learning more on business transactions and playing around with auto deduction rules and learning how to configure custom deduction rules for transactions. Thank you for watching. Happy learning.